Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for joining the session on what's next for Scope 2 reporting in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, understanding the process. Today, we're going to talk about the upcoming changes in the Scope 2 reporting. We're going to talk about potential impacts and how companies can engage in this process. First, let me say a word about why we're here. Why did we put together this first of two webinars? Basically, energy customers have crossed a big milestone lately. We have, since 2014, energy customers in the commercial and industrial sectors have contracted 100 gigawatts of carbon-free energy since 2014. We're very proud of that milestone. More work to be done, but this has been great. And a lot of that has been enabled by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, specifically the Scope 2 guidance. It has played a key role by giving recognition to companies when they are doing their share in procuring carbon emissions-free energy for their own operations. And this guidance, the Scope 2 guidance, is currently under revision, and it's very important that people understand what this guidance is, what the revisions are about, and how the process works. And so this is what we're here for to talk about today. So let me give a quick preview of the agenda. If you want to go to the, thank you. So we have Lee Taylor giving us an update on the overall process. Hannah will follow afterwards with her assessment of the impacts, the potential impacts of the proposed Scope 2 revisions. And lastly, we'll make sure we have some time for the discussion and Q&A from all of you in the audience. When you have questions, please put them into the Q&A function. Don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A function. That gives us a chance to monitor what actually is being asked, and we'll get to those questions at the end. So with that, let me introduce our panelists today. So today we have Lee Taylor from Resurety. Lee founded Resurety in 2012 to improve the transparency, liquidity, and impact of clean energy markets. Resurety is a leading provider of data, software, and services to the clean energy economy. And he will be followed by Hannah Hunt from Heineken. Hannah is the carbon policy lead for Heineken, and by my counting has at least 10 years of experience in the sector, if not more. She has also recently joined the technical working group of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and will give us some perspectives on that. And I just want to again make the point that we will have a second webinar on May 29, for which we'll go into a bit more details of the process, as we'll have more information, and we'll share additional corporate perspectives on what these changes could potentially mean. And Kerry has just informed us that the Q&A function is not working. We're just glad that Zoom is working. We had some problems, I think, yesterday or earlier this week, so we're just happy you're here and it works. Just put them in the chat, and that's fine. We'll handle it that way. With that, so actually, the next slide, just as I mentioned, today's this session about the overall changes, potential impacts, and how to engage. Next session, May 29, about more details. Maybe one quick reminder before we go into the actual webinar, just the antitrust reminder we have, basically don't get us into trouble, don't discuss any sensitive information on this webinar. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our two speakers. So first, we're going to start with Lee Taylor from Resurety. Lee, please, we want to take it over.
Great. Thanks, Marcus, very much, and for CEBA for hosting this. Based off the number of folks, it looks like have already dialed in. This is a hot topic. Hannah and I were talking earlier as carbon nerds. It's exciting to see a lot of people take this topic very seriously, as they should. As Marcus gave a great tee up, the Scope 2 market-based accounting method is something that's not terribly well known, certainly outside the clean buyer industry and even in some cases within it. But it's had enormous positive impacts on driving procurement to date, as well as having very significant potential impact on how procurement occurs in the future. So really appreciate CEBA creating the opportunity to talk through the details here. If we could advance the slide. I'll introduce my company very briefly as introduction. I'll then give a bit of a history of how we got to where we are today, and in particular, why there has been such strong and increasingly vocal calls for change for Scope 2 to be updated, to be a bit more modern given where we are in the energy transition and the corporate procurement process. Talk a bit about what that actual process is and timelines and areas where CEBA members can have direct influence and impact on having their voice be heard. And then I do want to get a bit into the details of what some of the potential emerging likely changes are and what that would mean tactically for corporate procurement, and what that would mean for year-end reporting. So that's what I'm going to cover today. We can advance, please, Marcus. As a quick reintroduction, Marcus highlighted this. My name is Lee Taylor. I'm the CEO of Resurety, and we are a 12-year-old company. I'm based here in Boston, and our entire focus is on providing the tools needed for the buyers and sellers of clean energy, typically wind and solar, and increasingly storage, as well as investors in those assets to have the information they need to make decisions, monitor the impact of those decisions, and actually facilitate a lot of those transactions across data, software, and marketplace regulated solutions. And that is both in a financial context, but also in the impact context. If we advance a slide, there are all sorts of different flavors today, both from a voluntary basis as well as a compliance basis, whether we're talking voluntary procurement under Scope 2, 45V tax credits for green hydrogen, emerging rules around direct air capture, across voluntary and compliance mechanisms. There's a lot of different ways that buying green gets defined. And we work with every single one of those applications today to make that possible. And I think that's a big part of our role today, hopefully, is to talk about tangibly what do different rule changes mean when you have to actually work with the underlying data to report that year-end number. So we can advance the slide, please. Just a step back for a second to make sure everybody's on the same page. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the rule book for reporting what your carbon footprint is, and it's used by the vast majority of voluntary reporting entities. It's a little over 25 years old at this point, having been originally written by World Resources Institute and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. And in particular, the Scope 2 accounting was written, initially released in 2014 and finalized in 2015. But at the end of the day, it is your carbon, the measure of your carbon footprint, and broken down into 3 different buckets. So Scope 1 accounting is direct emissions. So if you are a steel producer and you burn a fuel in order to heat a furnace, the emissions from burning that fuel to produce that heat is direct on-site emissions that falls within your Scope 2, or excuse me, Scope 1. We're here today to talk about Scope 2, which is indirect emissions from electricity consumption. So if at your office, if at your office you turn the lights on, somewhere else in the grid, a generator has to ramp up in order to serve that growth in consumption on the grid. And that generator is going to be producing emissions, whether that's a gas plant, a coal plant, or it would not be producing emissions if it was a wind or solar project. That's Scope 2. Scope 3 being your supply chain. So if you're a retailer and someone has to deliver what you're selling from another country, and the emissions of that ship, that plane, are going into your Scope 3. So those are the overall collection of the scopes, but today we're going to be exclusively focused on Scope 2, that direct emissions from off-site electricity generation. We can advance the slide. As Marcus pointed out, there's been huge successes in the clean energy buying community, most notably recently announcing CEBA announcing the 100 gigawatts of procurement. Putting that in context, that's meaningfully larger than the entire installed capacity of the U.S. nuclear fleet. So this is an enormous accomplishment. It is worth noting that when you look at this graph, almost all of that procurement has happened in the past decade, 95+%. And we've been on with a few years of modulation there, but pretty much a one-way trip up and to the right of additional procurement. But it's important to realize what changed in 2015, and we can advance the slide, and that is the release of the Scope 2 protocol. So if you can advance the slide, please. In 2015, Scope 2 carbon accounting was released. That was where really the rule book of how you would retire a REC in order to reduce your carbon footprint became standard practice. And so, for example, Clean Air Task Force is a leading NGO in this space, have given very deserved credit to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for being one of the largest motivating factors in voluntary procurement that has resulted in this 100 gigawatts that we all take great pride in today. We can advance the slide. That being said, the Clean Air Task Force and a lot of other folks have gone on to say, while it's been enormously impactful for the last decade, it is not sufficient to the decade ahead. And ultimately, there are 2 criticisms that primarily are levied against the existing rules that a lot of the rewrite is intended to address. The first is that it is not, as written today, a terribly accurate physical inventory of emissions, and we'll get into specifically why. But the other side is that it doesn't accurately measure and incentivize real world impact, often called consequential emissions. So those two shortcomings, the accuracy as a physical inventory and the accuracy as a measure of impact in a but-for scenario. So if you intervene into the grid by buying a PPA from a new build project, for example, that action is changing the grid's carbon intensity against what it would have done but for your action, and measuring that and incentivizing that behavior is another area where the current protocol falls short. And that's really what's been leading to the calls here, and we can advance the slide. And I would say that up until about a year or two ago, that was largely within more of sort of the, I would say, broadly the carbon nerd community, the folks who are focused on how this is done accurately. But it is now, on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian. In just the past 2 years, I've taken 4 articles here, but this is a very small subset of all the articles that have come out, where they have either highlighted the shortcomings of the current protocol, or in some cases, and I would argue frustratingly, have taken corporate buyers to task for following those rules, and saying that because those rules are not written in a way that is accurate, that is causing people to misreport their emissions, when in reality, they're following the rule book that exists today. And so I think this has really motivated a significant push to make sure that the revisions of this protocol give people the tools to not only feel like they are reporting accurately, incentivizing impact, but it can have confidence that when they report out under those rules, they're not going to have backlash explicitly for following those rules. So that's been a big motivator for why these changes are needed today. We can advance the slide, please. Where we are in that process. So we're a little over halfway through this. It should be noted that while we're talking about this now, this is a process that started in mid-2022. So there's been initial feedback from the market, as well as last year. There's a lot of focus on building the teams needed to support the recommendations and the revisions of these protocols. Hannah is a member of the technical working group for Scope 2, so it's one of the groups that was formed in the past year to do this. Where we are today in 2025, or in Q2 of 2025, is we're about halfway through the first draft writing process of the Scope 2 protocol that's intended to be revised. So at some point this summer, the expectation is that first draft will be released, which will then be followed by a public comment period, which will be followed then by a revision period in response to that public comment. In parallel with that, there will be another process kicked off, which is the phase 2. This is more into the granularity of how phase 1 would get actually implemented in practice, what data sets, how do you treat certain corner case situations, et cetera. And then that will advance through revisions and ultimately the final publication as anticipated in 2027. I would note that while when you look at this on first blush, and you can advance the slide one, it looks like there's a lot of time left for this to happen because there's still 2 years and change. That being said, the period when practitioners have an opportunity to really have their voice heard, to impact if and how those rules are changed to reflect your perspective, is really more like 3, 6, 12 months. That first revision is, as I said, coming out this summer. Then there's a public comment period. So I think for anybody who's watching this, whose organization views the Scope 2 carbon accounting rules as really important to your procurement strategy, if you want your voice heard, the time is now, and we'll talk about how you might do that shortly. But I just want to highlight that this is a long process, but we are really in a crunch period at the moment to have feedback received by the technical working groups as well as the Scope 2 protocol more broadly. You can advance the slide, please. So in terms of what the goals are, when we went back to the comments that were made by the Clean Air Task Force about the 2 problems that were highlighted with the current protocol, one was, one of the goals is how do you make Scope 2 carbon accounting a more accurate physical inventory? So when someone says, I'm consuming carbon-free energy physically at my location, how do we stand behind that claim with more rigor? And the second goal is related to how do you stand behind the claim with more rigor of your impact? So saying, well, I may or may not be physically sourcing electricity from the intervention I've taken in the market, but that intervention has resulted in an X% reduction in my induced emissions. So the view at the moment is the current protocol doesn't do either of those as well as it could. And so on the physical inventory side, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has convened the Scope 2 Technical Working Group. This is roughly 35 individuals who are market participants, modeling experts, NGOs, who are making recommendations to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol on what changes to that protocol on Scope 2 would result in a more accurate physical inventory. On the impact side of things, the consequential emissions impact subgroup is a subgroup of the technical working group for Scope 2, but their job is to really make that impact accounting more accurate and more useful to reporting entities. So that's the process that we're in to try to address those two changes. If we could advance the slide, please. On that first goal of a physical inventory, just to step back again to remind ourselves what problem we're trying to solve. So under Scope 2 accounting today, if you buy power from a new build project, bundled DPPA from a wind project in Oklahoma, the RECs associated with that wind project in Oklahoma from produced in January of a given year can be used to be claimed to physically source electricity that's consumed in Virginia in December. And so I think everyone can agree that power produced 11 months earlier, halfway across the country, is unlikely to actually serve that load. And that's what causes questions around use of renewable energy credits as a record of physical delivery and physical inventory. And so the way we see the technical working group, and I would highlight that this process is highly transparent. So there is a website the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides where you can see the every set of notes and presentations that all of these groups are providing. That's what gives a lot of visibility into this. And what we do see is the emerging recommendation from the technical working group is higher granularity in time and place. So that means hourly matching. So you're trying to align the timing per hour of your carbon-free energy consumption with the timing of your consumption of a grid-connected asset. And also same location. And by same location, that means physical deliverability. It's worth pointing out, it's not physically possible to trace power through grid-connected power lines. You can't steer power through grid-connected power lines. So there is no way to claim individual megawatt hours produced on another grid-connected asset. However, there's three different ways that are emerging as this definition of confident deliverability. The first is what's called same grid. So this would mean PJM. It's the 13, I think, states comprised in the Mid-Atlantic. And so the idea is that any carbon-free energy generator anywhere in PJM is considered deliverable anywhere else within PJM. So if you have a wind farm in northern Illinois, but you're consuming at a factory in Pennsylvania, you can assume those two are perfectly connected with transmission lines. The challenge is that as most people know, there are a lot of transmission challenges within grid regions. And so that's a bit of a strained definition of deliverability. And so more rigorous versions include same zone. So for example, that would mean if your consumption is in the Houston zone of ERCOT in Texas and your generation is in the Houston zone of Texas, those two would be considered effectively co-located from a transmission perspective. And the third option, considered the most rigorous, is the price differential. So in the US, as an illustrative case, most markets are nodal markets, which means that there are 35,000 different locations across the US where demand and supply are clearing every hour and setting a price. Within a given grid region, when the price of two locations within the same grid is identical, that is effectively an empirical demonstration of a lack of transmission congestion between those two locations. So effectively, anytime the point of your consumption and the point of your carbon-free energy procurement have the same price in the same hour, those are considered deliverable to one another. But at the end of the day, ultimately, the goal here is to try to create an accurate physical inventory that essentially replicates as if the carbon-free energy generation and your consumption are physically co-located. We can advance the slide. In terms of goal number 2, how do you make something that is a more accurate impact measure? It should be noted that as a physical inventory, the Scope 2 market-based method was never actually intended to incentivize anyone to measure the impact of an intervention. So inventory counting is intended to take the total amount of emissions and assign them to all the participants in a market. Impact accounting, which was formerly called and is published originally in 2007, project-based accounting, was intended to accurately measure what an intervention actually changed in terms of real-world grid emissions. That being said, in today's world, almost all goal setting and all measurement against those goals are done with physical inventory. And so in response to that, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has created a consequential subgroup who is tasked with making sure it is possible to accurately state what the impact of your market interventions are, whether that's a PPA with a renewable energy project or other carbon-focused scope 2 activity, and then also to make sure that that measurement is useful to your ultimate year-end reporting process to stakeholders. We can advance the slide, please. So those are the goals, those are the changes that are expected to come. I do want to walk through what that would look like in a real world scenario of procurement. So as scenario number one, imagine you're consuming power somewhere on the East Coast. Think about you're in PJM, so you could be in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, Maryland, et cetera. And in order to reduce your carbon footprint, you've signed a PPA with a wind farm in Oklahoma as part of the Southwestern Power Pool. If during that year you consume 100 megawatt hours at your location in Pennsylvania and you buy 100 megawatt hours of RECs from that Oklahoma wind farm, your carbon footprint under scope 2 is 0 during that year. You have fully reduced your emissions footprint. In the event that we shift to a temporal matching and deliverability physical inventory method under scope 2, you would get no credit for that procurement because that wind farm in Oklahoma is in the Southwestern Power Pool. Your load is in PJM. And so there is not a single definition that I think is being seriously considered for deliverability at the moment that would cause those two to be considered deliverable to one another. So those megawatt hours would not be useful to your scope 2 claims at year end. In terms of the impact accounting method, by consuming electricity in Pennsylvania, you're going to be increasing what's called your induced emissions. So if you hadn't been consuming electricity, for example, a gas plant wouldn't have produced as much power. And so by consuming electricity, you are causing or inducing emissions to be created. By buying power from a new build wind project, you are abating emissions or avoiding emissions by every one of those megawatt hours that is produced into the grid is crowding something else out of the grid. And in Oklahoma, that is often a gas or a coal plant. And so because of that, in this case, you would have reduced your emissions footprint from an induced emissions perspective by about 60%. Now, you might ask, if you bought 100 megawatt hours and you've consumed 100 megawatt hours, why isn't that 100%? And the answer, it comes down to grid carbon intensity. So the Oklahoma grid, and in particular during hours where it's windy, is a much cleaner grid than the Virginia or Pennsylvania area grid that is much more heavily reliant on coal to serve an around-the-clock load. So as a result of that, you're not fully reducing your induced emissions because you are buying the same amount of power, but in a cleaner grid. If you can advance the slide by one. Taking that down to a smaller case, let's imagine you are actually within the same grid region. So there's been a lot of corporate procurement in the ERCOT Texas footprint. So if you have consumption at an office building in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and you've sought to offset that by buying, from a carbon perspective, by buying power from a new build solar project in Western Texas, under the status quo, again, if you've consumed 100 megawatt hours and you've bought 100 megawatt hours worth of RECs, you are carbon free under the status quo. Under a temporal matching and deliverability perspective, how much you have reduced your carbon footprint ultimately is a function of how deliverability ends up being defined by the technical working group and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Under the same, can we go back to the slide or just on? Thanks very much. So under a same grid definition where it's assumed that there are no transmission congestion challenges within the ERCOT grid as a simplification, you would have matched about 40 megawatt hours out of those 100 megawatt hours. Here, I'm assuming you've got an around-the-clock consumption profile. So this will change meaningfully depending on what your consumption profile looks like. But if you've consumed 100 megawatt hours around the clock and you've bought 100 megawatt hours of solar power, about 40% of those hours are actually going to match one-to-one. And so your footprint there would have been reduced to 60 megawatt hours of consumed grid electricity times the grid emissions factor. If the definition of deliverability is the same zone within that location, to recognize the fact that ERCOT is not a perfectly connected grid, and there are very significant transmission challenges within ERCOT's grid. Same zone, you would be back to having a 0 MWh allocation because your load and your carbon-free consumption are in two different portions of the grid. Lastly, on price differential, this will entirely depend on where your load and your gen are located, but the ultimate answer is somewhere between 0 and 40, expected to be much closer to 40 in this case. But any hours where the price at the solar project and the price at the consumption location differ dramatically, the power during that period is not consumed is not matched during that hour. The one thing I want to highlight is the scale of these differences. So whether depending on how the Scope 2 accounting is rewritten over the coming months, your carbon footprint could be reduced by 100%, by 80%, by 60%, or by 0%, depending on what those rules are. And so that's part of the reason I think we're excited this webinar is happening. We're excited for this community to have a strong voice here because the scale is sort of hard of the impact of this on reporting and impacts that would have on procurement are sort of hard to understate. And so eager to have the discussion here today. With that, I will turn it over back to the CEBA team, but appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Lee, and compliment on being exactly on time the way we planned. That is perfect. With that, after this overview, I want to turn it over to Hannah to give more of a perspective from Heineken. We'll go into more of these in the next webinar as well in May 29. But here's Hannah from Heineken, please.
Thank you so much. Thanks to CEBA, Lee. That was excellent overview. Conscious too that we have a lot of chat and Q&A coming in, and we will definitely come back to those, but please keep them coming in. I'll try to address one or two of them as we go. I am going to be talking today primarily from the perspective of a corporate. They mentioned at the beginning that I do participate on the Scope 2, the technical working group. I do that in an individual capacity. For example, cannot technically represent CEBA or any of the other coalitions I'm a part of, but want to give the corporate perspective really to build on what Lee said and help to explain why Heineken finds the revisions to be so important and why I do think they are important for most, if not all, of the companies on this call today. I mean, so not just if you're part of a corporate, great, but if you're also a service provider or a project developer, this matters to you all too because you have clients that follow these standards. So to give background, I work as carbon policy lead at Heineken. So we are a very global company. We have set a suite of emissions reduction and renewable energy targets. We set those voluntarily for ourselves. If you look to the top, you can see we set a net zero ambition for ourselves to reach by 2040 across our entire value chain. So scopes 1, 2, and 3. This was a target that was validated by SBTi in 2023. But going back, we had actually started assembling renewable energy targets and decarbonization targets for many years. So that started back in 2021. We set 100% renewable electricity target with RE100. And now we also have a goal to reach by the end of this decade net zero in our own operations, so in scope 1 and 2. Now, I lay all of this out here because we have our targets. I know that all of you companies on this call have set up your own strategies and targets. For us, all of these targets are rooted in the greenhouse gas protocol. Like Lee said, it is how we calculate and report our baseline carbon footprint for scopes 1, 2, and 3. It is how we measure our progress. We use the corporate accounting and reporting standard. We also used the scope 2 guidance for this. It's true for when we first set our targets, we stand by continuing to use greenhouse gas protocol, and we report on an annual basis. So it's pretty fundamental to our measurement and reporting practices. If you can go to the next slide, please. Great. So while it's true for us, and I think for many of you all, that we follow the greenhouse gas protocol in calculating our carbon footprint, I think it's really important to mention too that it really is the foundation for the majority of the frameworks that we see, either voluntary or mandatory today, for carbon footprint reporting, target setting. So I'll start if you look to the top right. So SBTI, this is the organization we are a part of to set our net zero targets. SBTI's precedent has historically been to require companies, encourage them to use greenhouse gas protocol aligned inventories to make that the baseline for their target setting. If you look down to EU CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, this is very relevant for Heineken. I mean, we are headquartered in Amsterdam, but I think it is valid for a lot of people here on the call. So this is an incoming mandatory reporting framework, and in its legislation, it is explicitly referencing and aligning with greenhouse gas protocol as its methodology for calculating emissions and reporting into the EU framework. Even going down to the bottom left with CDP, which is a voluntary disclosure platform. We also report into this on an annual basis. I know that most companies do. Same process. They are explicitly mentioning and referencing greenhouse gas protocol as the standard that should be used. So all this to say, I mean, this is how, on a day-to-day basis, for all of us companies, that changes to the protocol are going to have a direct impact on not only how we calculate and report our annual carbon footprint, but also how we are going to be measuring progress against the targets that we're setting. And on a most practical level, it's going to mean that it impacts how our businesses can plan for the future and how we can plan to execute on our decarbonization strategies, which I think we all know it takes much more time and effort than it might seem. It can take years of forward thinking and planning, and especially cost planning. So I finally want to give a context for Heineken too, that we are a very, very global company. If you can go to the next slide, Marcus. So I know the CEBA is US based, but houses a lot of very global companies. For us, we have a mixture of breweries, malteries, cideries. It's in over 70 countries. We are calculating and reporting all of the electricity sourcing that we are doing according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 guidance. And so we are definitely absolutely coming from a position where new version of the protocol, it not only needs to be usable, but it needs to be usable across this entire range of markets, from the most developed markets like the US and Europe, down to the ones where the regulatory frameworks, where the sourcing options are still emerging in many ways, and a few years behind what we might see in ERCOT or PJM today. So this is to help all of you all start thinking through, I would say, what you want to see from a future version of the protocol. I'll add just one detail before we move on to the next slide. So the way that the technical working group is working through its proposals, and that the Secretariat and the Independent Standards Board are evaluating them, it is according to a hierarchy of criteria. And I'm starting to see this mentioned a little bit in the chat. So it is a hierarchy of criteria that starts with scientific accuracy, so scientific integrity, moves down into supporting decision making that will drive climate action, and then also includes a criteria on feasibility to implement. So the criteria are something that they are evaluating all of those proposals against right now, and that they're taking feedback on. So to the extent that stakeholders find that these proposals are not matching, for example, feasibility to implement or enabling climate action or scientific integrity, that is the type of feedback they're looking for in particular. Now, if we can go to slide 4 here, or the next slide, perfect. I do just want to spend a couple minutes here. These are my own, these are my views on some of the potential impacts that Lee mentioned, but just want to bring them to life a bit more for discussion. So first being the potential changes to the framework that will impact how emissions are calculated and reported. So this means for the market-based method in proposal in particular, that it can affect how PPAs, unbundled certificates, green tariffs, the full suite of market instruments can count towards emissions reductions. Now, in practice, this could mean, if you think back to what Lee was explaining, that accounting may need to become more granular for either time matching or more specific location matching. I mentioned here this example of market boundaries. Today, we know the existing market boundaries, such as normally national boundaries or the EU counts as a market boundary. But in the proposals, we all need to think through how certain proposals are prescribing more strict market boundaries. And to think about the feedback that you want to give that matches what your sourcing principles are and what is feasible for you to implement. I'll give an example from Heineken. So one type of market that we are in is Singapore. We have extremely limited sourcing options. Others might have the same experience because of how small the physical land availability is. So while we have followed existing market boundaries to date, and really as a sourcing principle for us, we care quite a bit about local sourcing when we can of renewables. But in markets like that, it has created a barrier where it has delayed our ability to make an investment of some kind in a neighboring market, for example, because it would go against market boundaries. So there are other proposals that are available, again, through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website, that have different levels of market boundary flexibility or strictness. So I would call that out in particular to look at what matches what you think is feasible to implement and what is matching with the most level of decarbonization impact you can have. Second point here is, again, I was mentioning it earlier, just the further reaching impacts of these changes on in particular target setting for net zero. So just reemphasizing here how this can shape how Scope 2 progress or how accounting in general is incorporated or assessed by other frameworks. So it was mentioned earlier in the chat too, there is a revision ongoing for the SBTI standard as well. That's very true and very live, and a lot of companies are engaged in that as well. So these will be moving at different timelines, but cognizant that these revisions happen on an ongoing basis. So even if SBTI is finishing a revision prior to Greenhouse Gas Protocol, they will go through future revisions too. And we do understand that these groups do try to align with each other as much as they can over time for consistency and for ease, definitely for companies. Point here. I do want to be clear, that the revisions here can create potential disruption to current strategies, or they can create potential opportunity. I should have been more clear about that. It can also be a great source of opportunity here to enable more clean energy investment. But the reason I mentioned disruption here is this was also mentioned in the chat too. The importance of through this revision process of addressing grandfathering. So making sure that investments that we've made today do not go unrecognized in a future version, and don't invalidate what investments were made in the past and the contracts that were signed. So that is something that we are thinking through the feedback that we will be giving, and would encourage other companies to do so. Last point here is really, again, that need for to give feedback on the need for practical implementation. So companies really should be thinking through the feedback that you'll give on how to make sure the revised standard reflects on the ground procurement realities. So, for example, with potential revisions to move towards hourly time or location matching, this is something to think about of from a data and reporting perspective, and also from a business cost and contracting perspective, what that would mean for you to be able to implement that sort of change over time. We are thinking through which proposals are going to enable the highest level across all companies for corporate action and grid decarbonization. These sorts of proposals, you do need to think through, for example, if it would lead to a future scenario where you might need to move from one PPA at your site to multiple PPAs to cover granular requirements and what the cost implications of that would be, or if it's something that would be workable, and to give that sort of detailed case study style feedback to greenhouse gas protocol. Now, these are top considerations. I do want to end out on how really how good of an opportunity we have right now to have CEBA's voices heard in this revisions process. So if you can go back to I'm sorry, forward to the last slide. So just showing here, just for example, like Lee was mentioning this earlier, a lot of the technical working group membership so far has, I think for a lot of good reason, they've needed to bring in a lot of highly technical expertise of climate modeling, emissions calculation experts, NGO input to help represent many buyers at this, many voices at the same time. But it is a lot of technical expertise, so it's really a prime opportunity, especially in the next 2 months, I would say, to add the voice we were saying of the practitioner, to say what is feasible, what is impactful. Like Lee was saying earlier, there are certain proposals that are trying to match physical reality better, and in many ways that's also a very good goal. But just wanting to balance again the scientific integrity with what will enable action and what will be feasible to implement. And this is something that we will go into next steps here and calls to action. But CEBA is thinking through this as well. But I do know that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Secretariat also values very much sort of individual feedback from companies. So I will stop there. I'm seeing a healthy chat and questions. So I think it's good that we save a couple extra minutes probably for the discussion.
I agree. Thanks a lot, Hannah, for the excellent overview from your perspective. All right. So again, today's goal was to give an overview of where do things stand, just in terms of the overall process, and then go into like one corporate perspective here from Hannah Han from Heineken, like how she perceives some of the issues here. I want to recognize this is a complex topic. There are lots of perspectives. There's lots of different buyers out there in the space, right? And the industry is not just buyers, obviously, too. So also developers and service providers have an important voice to have here. We have Hannah here today for the first part of this corporate perspective. We will have more corporate perspectives on May 29, but I want to get started now with getting some more into some of the details of the perspective. So Lee, first question for you, and this is a question I'm going to ask also again in May 29 when we have other participants. From your perspective, this is a very complex process. There's a lot of things to consider, a lot of things to balance. From your perspective, what is your view in terms of like how we're balancing here feasibility, integrity, and impact with the current proposals? Again, keeping in mind the proposals are not final, but it's just your current impression.
Yeah, so there's still a lot of work to be done, and that's why I think it's important that the enthusiasm in the chat. I think that enthusiasm making its way into either feedback to CEBA or feedback to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to have your voice heard in this is important. I'm optimistic that there are improvements that can help, to some of the comments that come in the chat, ensure that investment is made in geographies, technologies that have been underrepresented as part of the current structure. So today there's generally a pursuit of the lowest cost rec, which is increasingly not necessarily the location that the grid or the environment has the greatest impact. So are we driving dollars where they can have their highest impact? I think there is good opportunity to do that in a couple of different ways. I am concerned, echoing some of the notes in the chat, that complexity, rather than driving dollars from procurement, et cetera, to locations where and activities where it's most valuable, that complexity may just cause those dollars to leave the market as a result of the complexity. So I think I have that optimism. I think it's really important that overall premise doesn't meet too much complexity, and that to reduce the overall demand of sort of well-intentioned buyers who are trying to have real impact. So I'd say that is my current state as a response to that for now.
Thanks, Lee. Again, this is the question we're going to ask additional participants in May 29, but I value getting different perspectives here. The next question for Hannah, and I'm not sure it will be a hard one for you to answer, but one question was, what do we think the likely revision will be in terms of time granularity? What will be in the final version? Will it be monthly? Will it be hourly? Will it be daily? I don't know if you have a view on this.
I don't know. I can give you a quick answer. Yeah, I don't know. But that is the point of this iterative process right now. I would suggest, Lee mentioned it earlier, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website does have a listing of all of the meeting slides that come out from the working group. There is a defined timeline right now where there will be a proposal that is shared for public consultation a couple of months from now, where it will show the consolidated proposal that would, if it includes a time matching element, that is when it will be shared for public comment. But I really just want to say this is, I will say they are looking for feedback and they want to discuss views transparently. So knowing that this is the types of options, so annual, monthly, hourly, or making it a requirement versus an option, this is the matrix of what's on the table. So this is the time when you can give that feedback, and this is again, that next 6 to 8 weeks is when it is best chance to have it be reflected in that consolidated proposal that would come out later this year.
Thank you, Hannah. Another question for Lee. You mentioned earlier that there are just the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There are also other standards and frameworks out there. How do you think the proposed revisions interact with those existing standards or frameworks? Do you think there's any alignment efforts or areas of potential friction that are worth highlighting today?
Yeah, I think it is worth highlighting, and that gets into a bit of the market-based method under Scope 2 today, moving with as it is today, and/or a future version that's intended to be more of a accurate sort of physical sourcing inventory. That's primarily what is used downstream in a lot of what Hannah had talked about. It's picked up as a foundation or is just utilized. Everything from some state level current or proposed carbon accounting rules, CDP, SBTI. So I think that one of the things that's been highlighted, and I mentioned earlier that for folks that are focused on saying, I've taken this action, that action has had this carbon impact. There's a rule book today called the project method that very few people utilize, in part because there isn't a way for that to flow through to other, SBTI, CDP type instruments. So I think it's really important that whatever is recommended to be used by corporate actors on a voluntary basis, it's considered how that is going to get picked up with other downstream reporting mechanisms. Because otherwise, I think a great accounting, let's assume everybody agreed it was the perfect accounting method. If it can't get picked up for goal setting and reporting against those goals, its utilization and therefore its impact will be highly limited.
Thank you, Lee. One more question for Hannah. From your perspective, what would help companies prepare more effectively for the range of outcomes being considered in these revisions?
It goes back, I think, to what I was saying earlier. Dive into the materials that have been made available by the Secretariat of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Tell Markus and Carrie that you're interested in being engaged on this as CEBA is ramping up their engagement. Also dive into anyone that's been. You can also reach out to. You are more than allowed to reach out to individual technical working group members as well to share your views. But I would say engage in the process as one of the public stakeholders. I intentionally wanted to share that makeup of the technical working group, but I fully believe you do not need to be part of the technical working group to have your voice heard right now. So I don't want to discourage anyone that is feeling like they're not a part of that process, that they aren't. You do still have a chance to have a seat at the table right now.
Thank you, Hannah. I see one panel question, sorry, one audience question for Lee again. So these changes to the greenhouse gas are coming alongside big proposed changes to the SBTi's corporate net zero standard. When combined, what do you believe this means for the future of the corporate interstate or cross-border VPPA market? Again, let me repeat this. These changes to the greenhouse gas protocol are coming alongside big proposed changes to the SBTi corporate net zero standard. When combined, what do you believe this means for the future of the corporate interstate / cross-border VPPA market?
That's a big question. I would say in the event that scope 2 accounting and its market-based method and sort of how it gets picked up or mirrored in SBTi, if that goes the direction of accounting really being a physical inventory and effectively attempting to replicate physical co-location, I think anyone who's on this webinar who followed this is a fairly similar dialogue that happened in relation to the 45V green hydrogen, where the idea is you're attempting to essentially physically source carbon-free energy on a grid-connected asset. By definition, if you're trying to match physically, cross-border procurement becomes difficult or impossible unless some other change also happens. And this is where I think a lot of the advocacy around a consequential method that says, look, I'm to Hannah's point, there are certain geographies where you might have load that you don't actually, for policy, economics, land availability, there's all sorts of reasons you might not be able to buy in that location. So the ability to say, well, I'm going to go to a place and have consequential impact there that will reduce my induced emissions. If those two things happen in parallel, then you still have a pretty robust opportunity for there to be cross-border. I think if accounting purely goes in the physical inventory method, cross-border really just then comes into shoulder cases where you can demonstrate that there's sufficient transmission crossing those borders in the case that you're on adjacent borders. But short answer is there's a potential for it to become extremely limited depending on how the rules get rewritten.
Thanks, Lee. One more question for Hannah. Do you see differences in how multinational companies like Heineken may need to adapt Scope 2 strategies across regions with varying policy and market maturity? Let me repeat this. Do you see differences in how multinational companies like Heineken may need to adapt Scope 2 strategies across regions with varying policy and market maturity?
Sure. Right. I'll try and answer this. I think a company, any sort of multinational company, you try to adapt your strategy based on. For us, we try to start with what we consider the highest impact type of investments. We attempt long-term PPAs or on-site investments where possible, but when that's not possible, we do as a company move through a hierarchy that would move to green tariffs, or if nothing else is as a last resort for us unbundled certificates, and that is still today based on the current framework that we have for greenhouse gas protocol for RE100. The bigger question of how does this affect our strategies depending on the revisions? It is too early to say. But for us, wanting to see greenhouse gas protocol stay as the standard, that is a big reason why we're engaged right now, is to see the directions this is heading and try to influence in a way where we can still operate inside the framework. But I think that's a big point of why up until now we've also had a menu of options available. Again, ranging from PPAs to certificates.
Gotcha. Thanks, Hannah. All right, and now I'm in the unenviable position of going through the remaining 20 questions we have here. One I guess I'll just flag this again. My point is also like the purpose of this, like one is for these webinars to inform, and I think that was the first 2/3 I would say of this webinar, and the second one is to share also different perspectives. In that vein, I want to this is more of a comment, but I want to flag one comment from Rick Hunter here from Pivot Energy. He said is that these changes that are being discussed are essential ensuring that the impact of corporate investment is strong and the new approach is not that difficult. All necessary tools and software are already in place that make it relatively simple to achieve this new accounting. Again, this is something I will recognize there's lots of different perspectives on this here. I just want to flag, like, maybe both for Lee and for Hannah, if you want to share your view this time, like kind of just from your personal perspective. Again, the comment being the changes are, we've had a bunch of discussions, right? There's a lot of comments here that these changes are quite difficult. This viewpoint here, like this is quite easy. Like if you want to share your perspective on that.
Sure, happy to. And yeah, I think just to broadly try to address what feels like some of the tone in the chat. I mean, I think from my perspective, the goal of changing and making revisions to Scope 2 is it originated and continues to come from a place of how do we improve upon success we've had. We've brought enormous amount of voluntary procurement into the renewable markets. I think everybody on this webinar thinks that that's a very positive thing. That being said, there are a lot of differences of opinion. There have been increasingly aggressive press around this, something that is additional, not additional, bundled, unbundled, high intensity carbon intensity grid, low carbon intensity grid, buying in a location where you're adding load and sort of grid citizenship. There's a lot of very valid questions around ways that this can be improved. And I think the goal of this was to try to figure out how can we I'm speaking for Greenhouse Gas Protocol here, but I think the intention was how do we improve upon things to make sure that we can address some of those valid concerns while still making this viable as a tool as a day-to-day basis. To the person who mentioned the point that there's new tools and that this is sort of easy in today's market, I wholeheartedly agree that since 2014, the set of tools, the data that is available, a lot of that data is also free. Today, carbon intensity data globally is free, for example. The tools have changed a lot. I would disagree that it is easy to do all of these today. I think that some of these policies, particularly hourly level, ensuring no transmission between gen and consumption at any location, that's a high bar. And I think that part of the reason that we wanted to support this webinar was a lot of this, these changes are coming, and it's important that that voice of how a practitioner would be able to do this or not is critical to be said. So, but I just want to reiterate, yes, the tools have made things easier. No, these, depending on how these are finally drafted, not almost anything will be harder than the status quo, period. A question of how much harder is a question, but I think that those changes are also coming from valid concerns around some shortcomings of the current structure. And so I would say overall around the tone, I think these were, and remain well-intentioned changes, but it's important that the practitioner's voice of what's operationally viable is heard as part of that process.
Yeah, and I would just add too that there was one comment asking if this is also a framework that's meant for smaller buyers, and absolutely it is. So it's something that priority of mine is making sure that, like Lee was saying, is everyone is aiming to address shortcomings and improve scientific accuracy, granularity, that we take everyone along with us. Companies face enough headwinds as it is day to day in today's reality. So being able to improve accuracy and transparency, we don't want it to come at the cost of people's participation in the framework.
And the only thing because I'm trying to follow the chats that are coming in live, there was one question I think is worth addressing that, I lost it, but I think the tone of it was effectively, is this something that is sort of a outside chance that these changes could happen, and this is sort of a art of this is possible, or this is what's likely to happen? I just want to highlight, like, these rules are being rewritten. How exactly they will be rewritten remains TBD, but they're on track to have material changes and have those material changes released within months. So I just want to highlight that to the beginning of this, there is some urgency towards the practitioner voice being heard. So this was not intended to be a 5% scenario. Like, these rules are being rewritten.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of the chat. So one thing I just want to again flag is that we at CEBA, we really, really want to make sure we have a good sense of where different organizations stand on this. So as Kerry mentioned also in the chat, I encourage everyone here for views that if you don't already know your view, please reach out to us. Kerry put in her email address in the chat. Kerry, actually, would you mind just putting it one more time in there, actually, so that people really have it for sure? We really want to hear from you all where your perspectives are on this. That's one key thing that we want you to do. And same also, I think it's helpful to share your perspectives with the technical working group, with the independent standards board. If you don't know how to, please again reach out to us. We're more than happy to facilitate that. We're in dialogue with these organizations ourselves, but that's a key point I want to make here. And the last 2 points is that we'll have another webinar on this topic, May 29. So as Lee was mentioning earlier, the technical working group right now is finalizing recommendations, but there's still a bit of time until these recommendations are final. So the next webinar will go over what does it look like in terms of the recommendations as they're getting closer to the finishing line. And so that will be the subject of the next webinar on May 29, and we'll also go into more details, like more corporate perspectives on this. So stay tuned for that. And the last, just more of a midterm preview for you. Be aware that right now is a good time already to give feedback to us and to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but there will be a public comments period at the end of this year, basically in the fall. Stay tuned, we'll give more updates on this, but basically if you could be mindful of this, there's another official public consultation phase, I think starting in October this year. All right, I think we're officially at the end of the time. I just want to again thank you both to Lee and Hannah for offering your time, and for everyone. This has been a super well attended webinar. We really appreciate you tuning in, asking all the questions. Thanks so much, and looking forward to have the next webinar, May 29. Thank you all very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you.